What if I told you there was a playbook that the most toxic spiritual leaders use to control people? And what if I told you that by understanding the playbook, you can take back control and stop spiritual abuse in its tracks? That's what we're talking about on today's video. I'm going to be sharing the signs of narcissistic behavior, the most common narcissistic responses that are used to control conversations and people, and I'm going to be sharing how to respond to the spiritual narcissist in your life. So if you've ever been on the other side of spiritual narcissism or narcissistic behavior at all, this video is going to help you. And if not, it's going to help you to learn a lot about why narcissistic behavior causes so much damage in people over time. Now, we recently posted a podcast episode where we broke down the troubling narcissistic responses of a guest who was also a pastor, and I have heard from many of you, and I mean a lot of you, about how helpful that was and also how triggering it was. And because so many of you have asked questions about that video, we thought it would be helpful to do a follow-up video about how to recognize and respond to narcissistic behavior. And we also have a brand new resource for you today. It's going to be a downloadable PDF that highlights the common signs of narcissism, the most common narcissistic behaviors, and the best ways to respond when you encounter them. And a lot of the information we're going to talk about in this video is also included in that downloadable PDF. I'm going to share a little bit more at the end of this video on how you can download that and how we can get that into your hands. But I'm really excited about it because after the response to last week's video, we really thought that would be a helpful resource for you. Now, narcissistic behavior, especially in spiritual settings, it's incredibly dangerous. Unfortunately, it's also extremely hard to recognize on the surface. And if you've ever experienced it, you know that that's true. And that's exactly why we have to start talking about it in Christian circles. Otherwise, narcissistic behavior and narcissistic leaders are going to keep us stuck. They're going to keep people stuck in cycles of trauma, spiritual abuse, and church hurt. So we've got to start having these conversations and learn how to do something about these narcissistic leaders in our churches. And to be completely candid, a lot of spiritual leaders and church leaders who do this, I don't think they're doing it on purpose. Now, there's a lot of people who would disagree with me and would say, Jeff, anytime you encounter narcissistic behavior, they know exactly what they're doing. But I really do believe that there's a lot of them that don't, and they're not trying to hurt people on purpose. But these learned behaviors, they've learned that they work, and they've never learned what they are and the damage that they do. But I love the way that narcissism expert Ramani Deversla puts it. She puts it this way:
forget the term and focus on the behavior. We have to give people permission to identify what bad behavior is and throw the backstory away. So the problem is people say, I know he's bad, but the reason he does this is da-da-da-da-da-da. And they give a laundry list of everything from a bad day to a tough dad to whatever, historical something or other that happened to him. I said, I have no doubt that stuff happened, and this behavior is unacceptable. So as long as you're with this person, you're enduring unacceptable behavior. And if you're able to sleep at night because you do a long string of rationalizations, and as long as you don't make it about you, okay, you do you. But the more you make justifications and then even internalize and say, well, maybe I'm a bad person for calling them out on their behavior, then it's a problem.
We've got to start being able to talk about the damage and the danger of narcissistic behaviors without the backstory. And the truth is, until we can start talking about the dangers of these kind of behaviors without the backstory, without excusing it, without explaining it away, without being worried about someone getting their feelings hurt because we called their behavior narcissistic, okay? We can't worry about all that and then excuse the behaviors. We got to talk about the behaviors first and separate them from intent, separate them from motive, separate them from what people know. But we have to, and I do mean we have to, start talking about these behaviors and how to respond to them. And we've talked about this in previous videos multiple times, But just because a person exhibits narcissistic behaviors, that doesn't mean that they're a narcissist, and it definitely doesn't mean that they have diagnosable narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, which is traditionally what people think of when they hear that a person is a narcissist. So if you want to learn more about that, you want to learn more about the narcissism spectrum, you want to learn more about how this stuff can look in spiritual environments, I invite you to go ahead and check out a previous video that we did with narcissism expert Chelsea Brooke Cole. It was a fantastic conversation, and given some of the conversations we've had recently, she's someone who I would love to have back on the podcast. We're going to see if we can work that out. But if you haven't got a chance to watch that episode, do yourself a favor, go ahead and check that out. That will help you to understand a lot more about spiritual narcissism. But today, we're going to talk about in this video, again, what are the signs of narcissistic behavior? How can we recognize them? What are those most common narcissistic behaviors that we need to recognize that are going to do a lot of damage if we don't see them? And here's the deal. Here's why this is so important. If you don't know how to recognize narcissistic behaviors, then it's almost impossible to escape them. But once you know the playbook, the narcissistic people in your life, they are going to lose the control that they've had over you. Because once you know the playbook and you know how to recognize it, it is going to disarm them. It's going to take the power and the ability to manipulate you right out of their hands. And in today's video, we're going to cover the first half of the 27 most common narcissistic behaviors that we see in churches and spiritual environments. We're going to give you information on how to recognize them and how to respond to them. We're going to cover half in today's video, and then we're going to finish the rest into tomorrow's video for a total of 27 common narcissistic behaviors that we have to learn how to recognize. So go ahead and buckle up for part one of the most common narcissistic behaviors in spiritual narcissism. And I want to go ahead and tell you before we get started, a lot of these overlap, and that is a big part of the reason why they're so hard to recognize, because you're going to notice that some of these traits, they overlap and are doing multiple things at the same time. They're real hard to catch in real time if we don't know what they are. But let's go ahead and start with one that has become much more commonly talked about, much more well-known recently, and that is love bombing. If you've never heard about love bombing is a type of emotional abuse in which someone uses grand gestures to manipulate another person. So a love bomber, they may bomb you with gifts, compliments, affection, but these actions, they're not done out of kindness. This is a person who is using love bombing instead to make a friend, a partner, a loved one, a congregant, whoever, dependent on them. They're doing this to make you dependent on them so that they can control the relationship. And that whole definition comes from Carly Malone in a health.com medically reviewed article. But that's what love bombing is. Love bombing is this whole idea where they are showering you with love, admiration, appreciation, but not because they love you and appreciate you. It's actually a way of controlling you. It's a way of gaslighting, really. So what are some examples of love bombing? Because we see these a lot in spiritual settings where people are love bombed on the front end, and that allows, especially more cult-like organizations, it allows more narcissistic leaders to control you easier on the back end. So here are a few examples of what love bombing may look like. It could look like constantly praising or complimenting. Okay, constantly praising or complimenting to the point to where it starts to make you feel a little uncomfortable. It feels great because we all love to be praised and complimented, but it feels uncomfortable because it feels like too much. And that tension can happen at the exact same time, okay? It could also look like rushing into a relationship. So when I was on a church staff, one particular church staff at a larger megachurch, within 3 months of being on staff, 3 months of getting there as a student pastor, they were already talking to me about becoming a campus pastor, okay? They were already talking to me about promotions. That was rushing into a relationship. And I look back on it now, it felt good at the time. It also felt a little uncomfortable. It felt too soon. But it was a part of love bombing to get me on their side and to help them gain control over me. It was too much, too soon. Love bombing can look like constantly calling, constantly texting, constantly emailing you. Love bombing could look like over-the-top declarations of affection or admiration. So at one church that I served at, I had a boss who would constantly tell people, we would meet somebody brand new, he would be introducing me to them, and he would say something like this: Jeff is a genius. Jeff's one of the smartest guys I've ever met. And guys, this was in first-time introductions to people. That's way too much, way too soon. And again, it felt good on one level to have him tell complete strangers this. On the other hand, it felt uncomfortable. It felt wrong. I wouldn't describe myself as a complete genius. I wouldn't describe myself that way. And that's a really weird way to introduce yourself to people. Why did it feel uncomfortable while also feeling good? Because it was love bombing, okay? It was designed, again, to get that person control and to be able to manipulate me later on. And it worked like a charm because I didn't know how to recognize love bombing. That's another way that it could look like. Now, the signs of love bombing can be very different for every person, but generally, they're going to leave you both feeling flattered and loved, but also at the same time, flattered and loved and also uncomfortable, okay? Trust your gut when you have that discomfort while also feeling really good. We like to lean into the good part and ignore the bad part. That discomfort is usually coming because we know something isn't right. Now, the second most common narcissistic behavior that I see in spiritual circles is deflecting. Now, here's a definition I want to give you for deflection. Deflection is a defense mechanism that's characterized by redirecting a conversation away from a challenging topic or issue to something less emotionally charged. It can manifest in various ways, such as changing the subject, asking a question, making a joke, or even becoming defensive or aggressive. Now, that definition comes from Natalie Buchwald. She's a licensed mental health counselor, and she wrote that definition writing in a peer-reviewed article for the Manhattan Mental Health Counseling, okay? But basically, deflection is, hey, look over here. Let's talk about something else. It's changing the subject. It's deflecting from something uncomfortable to talk about something else. Now, deflection is it's associated with other behaviors we're going to talk about today, like denial and blame shifting that are coming up next. So it involves anything they're going to do to evade unpleasant thoughts or feelings, all right? And instead, it's going to try to attribute responsibility for an undesired outcome to somebody else, okay? Now, the reason why it's often attributed to denial, blame shifting, those are ways of deflection, but they also do other damage. So again, a lot of these things are kind of enmeshed. A lot of these things have crossover. That's what makes them so difficult to recognize, okay? Here's some examples of deflection. Deflection could look like denying a fact that makes the person look bad, or denying they even said something or did something that they definitely said or definitely did. It could look like shifting blame from themselves when cornered or uncomfortable to the person who actually pointed out the issue, or to a third party who's not even there, and that's a form of scapegoating, something we call scapegoating. It could look like ridiculing you in an attempt to devalue or humiliate you. And think of it like this. When it's done like that, it's like a counterattack. The way to deflect from what they don't want to talk about is to counterattack you. It could look like abruptly changing subjects to a related but different topic. So if you look at the podcast episode I referenced earlier when we were talking with Pastor Jerry Lawson, I was sharing with him how his social media comments had made small churches and small church pastors hurt. It had frustrated them. And instead of answering my questions or discussing how his comments had made people feel, instead he interrupted to ask this. He said, well, why do you think small churches are successful? What about these small churches makes you think that they're successful? It seemed related on the surface, but it was really a bait and switch. It was, hey, I don't want to talk about how my comment made people feel. So instead, let's talk about what you think about small churches. It was a pure deflection designed to move the conversation in a different direction. That's number two. Number three, the third most common narcissistic behavior we see in spiritual narcissism, it's denial. And it's usually denial of facts or opinions that are contrary to the narcissistic leader's own, okay? Now, again, like we said a minute ago, denial is a form of deflection, okay? It's a refusal to acknowledge a threatening, uncomfortable, or inconvenient truth. And denial is also a developmentally normal, unconscious defense mechanism that's usually present in early childhood. Now, with more narcissistic people or narcissists themselves, they oftentimes don't grow out of those early childhood behaviors. And again, that definition comes from Julie Hall writing for Psychology Today. Now, here are some examples of denial, okay? It could be dismissal. They would say something like, hey, I know that thing you talked to me about, that was so long ago, I can't even remember it. Why would you bring up something so far back in the past? It could look like justification, which is a way of rationalizing the behavior to make it sound reasonable. So in that same conversation with Pastor Jerry Lawson, we talked about plagiarism, and I had concerns about an organization he's a part of supporting plagiarism. And he just tried to justify it. He tried to justify that plagiarism doesn't apply to pastors because, as he said, we're just helping each other serve God and people well. We're doing a good thing, so it can't be bad. That was kind of the justification that he gave. Okay, it was a form of denial. And then the last form of denial that I'll give you as an example is minimization. It could be acknowledging a fact, but in acknowledging it, at the same time attempting to reduce its effect or importance. So yeah, that happened, but it's not really that big of a deal. All right. The fourth most common behavior that we see in spiritual narcissism is blame shifting. I see this one all of the time. And again, guys, as we're going through these 27 common behaviors, they're not in order. It's not that the first one we talked about is less or more common. These are just common behaviors that we see all the time. And blame shifting is one of the ones that I see most. Okay. So you may be saying, Jeff, what is blame shifting? Blame shifting is the redirection of responsibility for one person's actions, their behavior, their mistakes, onto another person, group, or thing. And that definition comes from narcissisticabuserehab.com. So what are some examples of blame shifting? What could this look like in spiritual narcissism, in day-to-day conversations that you might have with someone else in church or a church leader or a family member? It could look like saying, you bring up a concern and a person says, and you don't think you do that? Right there, they've shifted blame. And you don't think you do that? You're part of the problem too, right? It could look like this. Well, I would listen if it wasn't for your tone of voice. And now they're blaming they're not listening on you. It could look like saying something like, wow, it's never good enough for you, is it? No matter what I do, it never seems to be good enough. It could look like asking, why would you bring that up now? Why would you? It's such a low blow to bring up something from the past like that, even if it's valid. Let's give an example from the interview that I've referenced a couple of times already. I'll keep referencing. Let's give an example from the interview with Jerry Lawson, though. In response to questions about the effects of his social media comments on others that we talked about a minute ago, he said this. He stopped and he said, well, Jeff, remember, you're the one who put that piece of media on TikTok. And I'm very limited in the amount of comments that I can leave on TikTok. You chose to put that on TikTok. Why did he say that? That was a form of blame shifting. He was taking the blame off of how what he said affected people and saying, well, it's your fault for putting it on TikTok. This can be really subtle, but when you learn how to see it, blame shifting is one of the most common techniques that I see narcissists go to in conversations at any level. Number 5, the next narcissistic behavior is invalidation. Invalidation is the act of purposefully denying, rejecting, or minimizing, negatively judging, and or ignoring your expressed experience, thoughts, actions, or emotions, okay? That's invalidation. That comes from a 2018 NarcWise article. Here are some examples of invalidation, okay? It could be someone saying, you share a concern and they say, well, you shouldn't feel that way. Or they say, you're overreacting. You're just too sensitive. Have you ever heard that one? That's a form of invalidation. You're too sensitive. They're invalidating your feelings. You wouldn't feel that way if you weren't too sensitive, okay? They could say things like, you take things too seriously. Or, you're wrong. That isn't how you feel. This is how you feel. And that may seem crazy to you. Someone saying, this isn't how you feel, but instead you feel this way. But if that seems crazy to you, look at how easily it happens. In that interview with Jerry Lawson, when I was sharing my concerns about some of his social media comments, I said it felt like those comments were affecting people in this way. It felt like you were doing X, right? And when I said that, his response was he interrupted me and he said, no, that's not how you felt. That's not how you felt. And that's a good example of this. It seems crazy talking about it like this, but in the conversation, he hit it, he said it, he moved on. And if I wasn't paying attention, I wouldn't have noticed it, okay? These things coming at you in real time can be very hard to recognize. But again, invalidation, a lot of times it's invalidating your feelings by saying that's not how you felt. Anytime someone tells you that you didn't feel the way that you said you felt, it is a narcissistic response every single time. Now that brings us to the next common narcissistic behavior. You probably heard a lot about this one. This phrase is really popular right now. It gets misused a lot. So let's talk about what it really is, okay? It's gaslighting. And crazy enough, I've had people accuse me of gaslighting who obviously don't know what the definition is at all. They've accused us of gaslighting when, guys, we have people, psychological professionals, who look at all the stuff that we're doing, okay? We are very careful. I know I'm capable of gaslighting, so we're checking on that stuff all the time. But the amount of times people have accused me of gaslighting, and it's been about something totally different, we got to be careful with some of these terms, make sure we know what they actually mean. So let's break down the definition of gaslighting, because this is dangerous and it's extremely common in narcissistic responses. But gaslighting is a form of manipulation that often occurs in abusive relationships, including spiritually abusive relationships. And it's a covert type of emotional abuse in which a bully or abuser misleads the target. And they create a false narrative, making them question their judgments and reality. That's what gaslighting comes down to at the end. It's a subtle way of making a person question their perceptions and reality. And that definition comes from Jay Brines in Call Me Crazy, The Subtle Power of Gaslighting, an article in the Berkeley Science Review from 2012, okay? Now, gaslighting's become all the rage, something we talk about now, but at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's someone trying to get you to question or disbelieve your own perceptions or reality. So here are some examples, real-world examples of gaslighting, okay? It could be used as a part of denial, blame shifting, and minimization, but it's often rewriting history. It's a way of rewriting history. So going back again to the interview that I had with Jerry, and we've linked that. You can watch that here if you haven't watched it already. At one point, I was talking about something I'd already said that he'd push back on. So he'd pushed back on something I'd already said, and I said this. When I said, going back to what I'd already told him, when I said you were probably one of the most critical people of the podcast, and he interrupted me in that moment, didn't let me finish the sentence. He interrupted me and said, no, you didn't say that. That's not what you said. You said I was the most critical. You didn't say I was probably the most critical. And in that moment, I started questioning. Well, I thought I said you were probably the most critical, but maybe I didn't. Oh my goodness. Well, if I didn't say it that way, if I said it the wrong way, man, that would make sense maybe why he's mad. Maybe this is my fault, right? And it made me question my reality and perceptions. Now, the good news is, with it being a podcast interview, I could go back, and we showed you, if you watched that interview, we went back and just looked to the tape, and I said exactly what I told him I said. I said he was probably one of the most critical people of the podcast. But again, if I didn't have that recorded, it caused me already to question my reality, and it would have caused me to do it more, okay? That's an example of gaslighting. Now, the next narcissistic behavior we're going to talk about is triangulation, okay? You may not have heard a lot about this, but triangulation can be extremely dangerous. Triangulation is when a person uses threats of exclusion or manipulation. And the goal of triangulation is to divide and conquer. It's a form of manipulation that involves the use of indirect communication, often behind someone's back, okay? So basically, and that definition, by the way, comes from Arlen Kunchik in a peer-reviewed article on Very Well Mind. But basically, when we're talking about triangulation is getting somebody else involved. Whether they're directly or indirectly involved, it's getting somebody else involved to support your narrative and to make the other person feel crazy or like they're wrong. According to therapy provider BetterHelp, they say this about triangulation. It involves them communicating primarily through a neutral party or otherwise drawing a third person into their own issues. And what does that do? It creates a triangle. That's why it's called triangulation. It creates a triangle between not just the two people in the conversation, but it creates that triangle of now bringing someone else into the conversation. So here are some examples of potential triangulation by a narcissist. It could be being asked to take sides on a specific issue. Okay, you might be being brought into the triangulation and not even realizing it. They're asking you to take sides so that they can control the other person. It could look like feeling pressured to choose who's right or who's wrong during a conflict. It could look like this, the person saying, well, you're in an argument. Well, person C agrees with me and they feel the same way. You're the only one here who doesn't see it. Now, they brought in a triangle and two sides of that triangle, they agree and they're against you, right? And it's a good way to control you. It could look like this. You know what? Let's ask person C for their opinion. I bet they'll agree with me. All of those are forms of triangulation, and it can be really, really dangerous in a conversation. The next common narcissistic behavior is stonewalling. If you've never heard about stonewalling is refusing to engage in or respond to a conversation or to a person's attempts to communicate. It's called stonewalling because basically it's a metaphor that draws from the concept of basically building a wall that keeps you from connecting. I built this emotional stone wall and I'm not talking to you. All right. It's like a kid acting like they can't hear someone that they don't want to talk to. And that definition comes from Anna Dreischer in a peer-reviewed article on Simply Psychology. Okay. Now here are some examples of stonewalling. Stonewalling could be somebody giving you the silent treatment. It could be someone refusing to communicate with you about a specific subject. So they may say, hey, I'm not talking about that. We're not talking about that today. That's a form of stonewalling. And it could be a threat to take their ball and go home if you don't play by their rules. Hey, if you keep trying to talk about that, I'm just going to leave the conversation, right? That's another form of stonewalling. Number 9, making false accusations, okay? According to Vernita Marsh and Dev Murphy, they said toxic people may resort to false accusations to deflect criticism. Okay, so if a narcissistic leader or person is getting criticism they don't like, one of the easiest ways to get rid of that criticism is to make false accusations, because now it puts you, again, it's blame shifting, puts you on your heels, and you feel like you're all of a sudden having to defend this crazy false accusation. Now you're not coming against them. So here are some examples of making false accusations. So in the interview with Jerry Lawson, after I called out a specific narcissistic response, I asked him not to do it anymore and basically said, we're not going to do that on this call. And his response was, he said, oh, so you're calling me a narcissist now? I called out a behavior and said that behavior is narcissistic. His accusation was completely false. You called me a narcissist. And I had to explain. Again, we talk about this often. Those are not the same things. You can have narcissistic behavior and not be a narcissist. But why did he do it that way? He knew I wasn't calling him a narcissist. That was simply a way to make a false accusation that would put me on my heels and get me to stop coming after him, because I put up a boundary and said this behavior is not okay. I'll give you a couple of other examples personally that I've seen in churches, okay? A former group of church elders that we were talking to about a church discipline issue. At one point, they were arguing over a post I'd made on social media that they thought was about them and had nothing to do with them. But they had gotten really hurt and insecure over this post. So what they said, I told them it wasn't about them, and they said, Jeff, most of your social media following, it's from our church. So your content affects us, and what you posted was aimed at hurting us. Now, that was a false accusation, though, because I was actually able to pull up numbers that night, and the numbers and data actually showed that most of my social media following wasn't even from the city that this church is in, okay? But again, making that false accusation, it pulled the pressure off of them. It pulled the pressure off of the leader that I was trying to bring church discipline to, and it shifted blame to us. So again, you're looking at this. This is also a form of blame shifting. Making false accusations is often a form of blame shifting. A lot of these are connected. We keep talking about it. They're interconnected, which makes it really hard to see a lot of times what's going on in these narcissistic conversations. The former pastor that I was, bringing those accusations against and saying, hey, I don't want you to be removed. I just want you to deal with this issue. This is hurting people. He made a false accusation to the elder board that I wanted and tried to get a job that I absolutely never wanted or applied for. It was a total surprise to me when that came up. It would have literally been the last job I would have ever taken, but he had made this false accusation to the elder board. Why? Because it made them question the accusation that I was bringing, okay? So what did I have to do with the elder board that night? I had to constantly play defense. We could not talk about the concerns I had brought until I first played defense, and I was on my heels that whole night. Why? Because of narcissistic behaviors. Number 10, the next narcissistic behavior is projecting. If you've never heard of projecting is basically when, because a narcissist's sense of self-esteem and their self-worth depends on how other people perceive them. They really care about how they look. They're going to tend to deny flaws in themselves and blame other people for their own shortcomings, okay? They're going to blame other people for their own mistakes, their own misfortunes. That's called projection, okay? Projection is when a narcissistic person and their tendencies, their behaviors, they project them onto someone else. So instead of owning up to their own issues, they project what they're doing on to you. That definition comes from Darius Sikanavicius on a Psych Central article. I'm pretty sure I butchered his name, but Darius had a great definition there. Here are some examples of that, okay? They could call you things that they are and you're not. They know they're calling you things and accusing you of things that they know they're doing and you're not. And when you get accused, you feel totally crazy, but you also don't know how to defend against it. Okay. Another one of these pieces, another way of projection is what's called the preemptive strike. Psychologists call it the preemptive strike because when a narcissistic person feels attacked, before you can attack them any farther, they start accusing you of doing things before you can even call them out on it. They accuse you of doing things that they think you're gonna accuse them of next. So it's a preemptive strike. They just want to get ahead of it, make you look bad, and in the process, make them look good. Jerry Lawson, in our interview, in response to me calling out his narcissistic behavior and setting a boundary, he stopped and said, "Jeff, are you bullying me? Are you trying to bully me right now, Jeff?" And what was crazy was I had to stop, had to compose myself and said, "Jerry, no, I'm not trying to bully you. You have been trying to bully me and control this conversation for the past 5 minutes." But he accused me of what he was doing. And he knew that that was coming next. It was a preemptive strike. Let me get in front of it. And if I call Jeff a bully, now he's on the defensive. So you've seen so many of these things that Jerry did. And I'm not trying to make Jerry look bad. You can look at that interview. They're all there. I'm trying to get you to see how using these different behaviors together, again, and intertwining them, when you use them together and you use them fast in real time, they're extremely difficult to notice if you don't know what you're looking out for. And they're all designed to make you second guess yourself and feel a little crazy. The next narcissistic behavior that is common is criticism and insults. Insults, put downs, and even mocking behaviors like laughing, which we talked about in that interview, as you express hurt. So they mock you, they put you down, or they laugh as you express hurt or concern. That definition comes from Hilary LeBeau in a peer-reviewed article on Psych Central. Now, here are some examples of that, okay? Here's some examples of criticism and results. You bring up a concern and they say, "That's stupid," or "That's so crazy. How could you even believe that?" Or they say something a little more direct, like, "There's got to be something wrong with you." You bring up a concern and their response is not to address the concern. It's to say, "There's something wrong with you." Or in the case of that interview with Jerry Lawson, we saw, "That's weak. You're going to have to do better than that," right? Those are all forms of criticism and insults. And again, just to put you on your heels and get you to stop advancing or stop talking about a concern or talk about something that they're more comfortable with in general. Number 12, the 12th behavior is devaluation. Narcissists devalue others as a way to boost their own self-esteem and maintain a sense of superiority. They might use extreme language. They might point out weaknesses and vulnerabilities of your own, or they may laugh at you. And there that comes again. This is a behavior that a lot of people want to push back against, and they don't want to say that, hey, laughing at you could be a narcissistic behavior. It's come up a couple of times. It's going to keep coming up because often it is. But they could laugh at you when you share how you feel. And that definition comes from Anna Drescher in a peer-reviewed article on Simply Psychology. But basically what we're talking about with devaluation, it's anything to make you feel less than. And again, mocking you, insulting you, laughing at you while you're sharing your feelings. That's what that does, okay? Some examples of that. Some examples of devaluation could be saying something like, "You're useless. You can't do anything right." It could be saying something like, "You're so naive," or "You're so stupid." It could be saying something like, "You'll never amount to anything," or "I can't believe I have to deal with someone like you," or "I can't believe I'm having to deal with something like this right now." Those are all things that subtly and some not so subtly devalue you and devalue your opinion. Now, humiliation, it is really the same as devaluation. That's number 13. Humiliation is really the same as devaluation. It's just taken to a greater extreme. And often when it becomes humiliation, that greater extreme, it's done in public or around others in order to truly humiliate or break you. So devaluation and humiliation are really together. All right, guys, that's a lot. That's enough for today. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to take a break, and we'll come back in another video tomorrow for part 2 of the most common narcissistic behaviors and how to respond to them. Okay, so we'll be back with part 2 tomorrow. We'll see you there. Until then, peace.